Where we are in,
Okay. Okay. I do want to mention a couple of things. My family moved here during relocation, and federal Indian policies. I would encourage all of you to kind of brush up on federal Indian policies. It is not something that is normally taught in schools, so don't be surprised if you don't even know what I'm really talking about. But federal Indian policies have had a huge impact on all of us as American Indians. And I use the term American Indian. The TREC Commission does prefer that term because it is how we are recognized in federal law. We are political entities. We are not just an ethnicity or a race. So even though we use Native, Native American, Indigenous, Indian, we use all of those interchangeably. In the TREC Commission report, we do prefer to use the term American Indian. My family moved out here during relocation, so back in the 1950s and 60s, when it was decided when the United States was busy rebuilding Europe after World War II, treaty obligations all of a sudden became too expensive, and so termination and relocation was kind of the solution to the problem that the United States came up with. Many tribes were terminated, so their federal recognition was terminated, and also individuals and families were incentivized to move to areas like Denver to kind of break those ties with our reservations. Denver was one of the original 4 relocation cities, and it is the reason why we have over 200 tribes represented here in the Denver metro area. We have tens of thousands of Native Americans here, especially along the Front Range. And that's important. It's important to know, and it's also important to be reminded that as tribal members are the rights that we have retained as being the original inhabitants of the United States, what we call Turtle Island. It doesn't matter where we reside, we still retain those rights. And so that's important. So even though I don't live on my home reservation, nor have I ever, other than a few summers here and there, I still retain those rights as a tribal member. So I just wanted to mention that, especially since growing up here, and also with my work as a Native educator, Native Americans, especially along the Front Range, we have been rendered almost completely invisible. And I do believe that was intentional. I don't think that's accidental. And so the work that TREC has really focused on has been, why is that? Why are we so invisible here? What was the history behind that, and what happened here to bring us to where we are today? The TREC is represented by 7 commissioners, all of who are tribal members of the 10 prioritized tribes, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But really their mission was to examine that untold history of what happened here, especially as it pertains to land displacement and genocide. And then to assess what was the financial harm, and what are the social ills that we see today. As an educator, I've done a lot of work around historical trauma, and we tend to focus on boarding schools because boarding schools were the most pervasive. There is not a Native family in this country that has not been severely impacted by boarding schools. My mom's a boarding school survivor. She went to Holy Childhood boarding school in Harbor Springs, Michigan. She had her language beaten out of her, and I don't say that as hyperbole. That really did happen. And so my family, we don't speak our native tongue anymore because of that. So there is not a family that has not been impacted. But before that, and I think it's really important for the state of Colorado to understand that the forced displacement of land, so our land loss, was really the original trauma. As Native people, our relationship with our land and water is so interconnected that we cannot be separated from it. However, many of us were violently separated, and there are a number of tribes here that are no longer within the state's boundaries that experienced violent forced displacement of their homelands. And that's really important to understand, and all Coloradans should know and understand this history, because it still impacts not only us as American Indians, but it impacts all of us. This is Colorado history, and it should be known and understood by all of our kids and all of us. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. Sorry, John. Okay, thank you. As we may or may not know, the state of Colorado does officially recognize 48 tribes as having historical significance in the state. And as you can imagine, when you are doing research and preparing a report, the thought of doing research for 48 entities is pretty daunting. So the TREC really boiled it down to tribes that had these three criteria. They had Aboriginal title, congressional title, and treaty title to lands that are now within the state's borders. These 10 federally recognized tribes meet all three of those criteria, and I won't read them. Three of those are the three youth bands, and then the Cheyenne Arapaho also include the northern bands and the southern bands, the Cheyenne and Arapaho. Let's see. There are also approximately 7 other tribes that ceded land here. So 7 other tribes that had that ceded land through treaties here in Colorado. One of the things, and I think Rick, did you bring boundary copies for everyone? Okay, so everyone's going to receive the TREC report. You will see a historic economic loss assessment that's included in that report. And that is probably one of the most significant findings that or assessments that we went through. The value of dispossessed lands is approximately $1.17 trillion. Mineral extraction is estimated to be $546.6 billion since 1858. Agricultural and water rights losses were not fully researched just because of time, so there needs to be further inquiry. And then loss of life and pain and suffering was also not fully assessed. I'm going to stop there to see if anybody has any questions about those numbers.
Members, do you have any questions as of right now? No questions. Go ahead and proceed.
As far as findings of land seizures, the two biggest ones that I want to talk about is that there are unresolved issues with Article 6 of the 1861 Fort Wise Treaty. And I think Rick was mentioning that 1861 treaty when I walked in. It resulted in an illegal land transfer of almost 20 million acres north of the South Platte. The federal government and the territorial government of Colorado knew that the land transfer was illegal at the time and did nothing. And the second one that I wanted to talk about was Colorado State University, which is our only land grant university in the state. Still retains possession of 19,000 acres from the initial land grant, and we could not find any public disclosure regarding the annual revenue that those parcels of land are generating. We have heard, not officially, but we estimate that it's in the millions of dollars annually with mineral extraction leases in particular. You can jump in. The other thing that I wanted to talk about, in addition to these bullet points, is that the majority of Coloradans are enrolled or have attended schools that do not cover any of this history. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, it should be mandatory for all of us as Coloradans to understand this history.
For the clarification on the slide, it's
Mr.
not
Williams?
the state land board, it's the school fund that has the $4.1 billion endowment. And the way that happened was when the United States government had taken the land, when the United States government had taken the land in 61, the following year, you had the Indian Settlement Act, you had the Railroad Act, and you had the School Act, and you had the Church Act. And all of those entities were eligible to receive Indian land. And that's why 61 was an important year for this treaty, but in addition to the gold rush. But remember, the land transfers to Colorado didn't happen until it became a state. So there was some intervening years in there before all of these land transfers. To give you an idea of what it looks like, the school fund was for every township, that township got 2 sections of land that were to be used for schools. The railroad for every mile got 10 miles on either side alternating for land to build the railroad. And all of this land was coming off the backs of Indian people. And particularly north of the South Platte, none of that land was ceded.
Some of the focuses of the TREC report is not just for the state of Colorado, but also for the federal government. So this first one, Congress, elimination of sovereign rights without justification, that would be for the federal government. The unacknowledged hunting and fishing rights. So for those 10 tribes, and really for all of the treaty tribes, so for those 17 tribes, hunting and fishing rights were never relinquished in any of those in any of those treaties. However, those tribal members do not enjoy hunting and fishing rights here in the state of Colorado.
So from a legal standpoint, in a treaty, when you're given this grant, it has to be abrogated by either another treaty or another federal law. And so there are at least 10 tribes who still have legal hunting and fishing rights in Colorado, according to the treaty. They've never been abrogated.
The recommendations for the TREC report focused on 3 things: restoration, reparation, and also reconciliation. And so I will go over those slides and let Rick jump in with some details. The restoration recommendations: rescind the right or denying tribal sovereignty, that's for the U.S. government; allow repositioning and reoccupation of traditional homelands, that's for both the state of Colorado and also the U.S. government; return unused railroad land and rectify illegal transfers; restore hunting and fishing rights; and for Colorado State University to return the Morrill Act land and provide support for Native students.
An important point here is that it's never been a part of this commission's intention that any private citizen's land will be, they're off. It's not about private citizens. I want that to be understood. We're not trying to take somebody's land. We understand what happened to our people when they lost their land, and we would never want private citizens to be exposed to that.
The reparation recommendations: add a 0.01% fee on all Colorado real estate transactions with the proceeds benefiting the 10 tribal nations.
I think of all of the things that we're asking, this one is the most important. If you think about the totality of the work that we've done regarding the truth and the issues, there's no real adequate way to create compensation for the wrongs. There's no adequate way to do this. One of the things that I'll say, we did not do nothing with Sand Creek. And we did not talk about Sand Creek or doing anything because the tribal members are still grieving, and it was hard for them to talk about something. We didn't do anything with Sand Creek. When we looked at this and we said, okay, we have all these issues. We have this litany of issues. What are we going to do about it? How can we what is a reasonable way to make this problem resolvable? And we thought, and we said, well, since a lot of this has to do with land, what if we were able to have the state legislature create a bill to add a 1% fee, not a tax, a 1% fee on all future real estate transactions? If that was the case, we estimate that would generate about $80 million a year. These revenues would be used and shared by those tribes and people that were wronged. One other caveat that I support is that money will never, 90% of that money would have to be used in the state holiday. So that's where that comes from.
Compensation for unauthorized land invasions in Sand Creek for Sand Creek descendants, restitution for slavery and loss of buffalo, free tuition and support for descendants of affected tribal nations, financial compensation for forced displacement and illegal land occupation. And the reconciliation recommendations: calculate and compensate for water rights and mineral losses, protect all native sacred sites, conduct public audit of land holdings and educational revenue, require accurate history teaching in schools and higher education.
There are 200 unprotected sacred sites in Colorado right now. This is for information from the U.S. Forest Service. Some of them's on private land, some of it's in public land, but they're not protected. And that's what concerns me.
I want to go ahead and open it up to questions before we move on. I know some of the PowerPoint, I believe the PowerPoint presentation is going to be shared with you, has a lot of the detail and the documentation, the historical documentation that goes along with a lot of the findings.
Great, thank you both. I was just gonna ask if you could share that with our staff and they can share it with us. Members, do you have any questions? Representative Joseph?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have two questions, and one of them was before on one of the slides before the recommendations. So if that's too much to ask, we can talk about it later. Can you tell us a little bit more about the different titles? Some of the titles were the Aboriginal, Treaty, and Congressional title. If you could tell us the difference between them.
Sure, I can address that. So, anytime you have land that is in a place, the people living there automatically are considered to have Aboriginal title, and that's basically the standard. The next level up is when, like in 1834, Congress issues congressional title. So Congress issued title to all Indians living in those areas, the title. Treaty title has more to do with creating the boundaries within the structure of that Indian title. It doesn't give up any of the land outside of the treaty boundaries, but because they were trying to create a sense about whose land was where, that's what they did with the 1851 treaty, which created the pattern for the tribes. The Southern Cheyenne and Southern Arapaho were more in Southern Colorado. The Kiowas, the Comanches, and the Apaches were in southeastern Colorado, and then you have a little bit, a bunch of Shoshones up in the northeast corner, and then you have the northern Arapaho in the north. So that's really how it was designed, and try to give kind of make sense of what was happening out in the west. Most of the time, the treaties were in response to either 1849 gold rush. So we had the 1851 treaty, which basically granted people access to cross but not stay. And then you have the 1861 Fort Wise Treaty here in Colorado. It was primarily because of the gold rush. In a very short period of time, you have 100,000 people come into the area. Now remember, the second part of the 1834 Act was that no white people were supposed to be in that red area. And if they were there, they were to be removed and fined $1,000 by the federal government. And so that's how that district attorney, when he saw that happening, he said, what are we gonna do, Governor Evans? We have 100,000 people, well, by then it was about 40,000. We have 40,000 people here who are living illegally. How are we going to remove them? Because this land belongs to the Indians. And that's what gets to a point of development. It was easier for them to develop a plan to exterminate and remove Indians from Colorado. 3 short years it primarily happened, 61 to 64. But that still doesn't answer the question, why are there no reservations in Colorado? I'll get to that later.
Representative Joseph.
Thank you. Now, I wanted to ask a question about the recommendations, and thank you for bringing these recommendations forward. I feel like I'm learning so much today, thank you. And what we can do to repair and restore some of the harm and damages that has been done to our native communities here in Colorado. My question for you is, how would we make sure the money, with the 1% you mentioned earlier on real estate fees, you mentioned that money, we would make sure that money is spent here in Colorado, that is my understanding. How would we be able to do that? Thank you.
If you think about it, for the youths it'll be easy, right? I mean, they're already here. Let these tribes who've been alienated from their homeland will have an opportunity to come back and use those resources to purchase land in Colorado, to reestablish themselves in their home. That's, that would be the intent. Also, I think that, a small portion of it could be used back in their where they're at today, where they're going to put on reservation. Now, mind you, this was very traumatic for some of these tribes. The Northern Cheyenne, when they were forced out of Colorado, they had no place to go to for 20 years. They traveled around, just wandering around for 20 years before the United States government put them on a reservation up in Montana next to the traditional enemies. That was pretty traumatic for us. And during those intervening years, they suffered 3 massacres. And so I think, those are the kinds of stories that you don't read in the history books. Those are the kinds of stories that we don't know about. And that's part of our responsibility, and with your help, we're gonna turn the spotlight on these issues and I think it's that time has come. 160 years is a long time for people to be ignored, swept under the rug, no consequences for what happened to them. That's not the way it usually happened in America. That's what makes this very unique, very unique to see